Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. I'm going to speak to you about countering violent extremism, which I believe is the primary national security challenge of our day. There are many reports almost every day about some incident in the world. Tourists who were massacred on a beach in Tunisia, concertgoers in Bataclan in Paris who were slaughtered, bombings at the airport in Brussels. We saw a list of Coptic Christians lined up on the Red Sea and beheaded. And the images of American journalists or aid workers in orange jumpsuits who were beheaded, seared into our memories. The Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant has become the #1 challenge in the counterterrorism field. How do we manage and how do we understand the phenomena of radical extremism? Why are people driven to join jihadi groups? And what do we do to respond to it? What's an effective strategy? Clearly, over the long term, we need to drain the swamp of support for radical groups. And we do that through education, through economic development, through counter-messaging so people understand there's an alternative to blowing themselves up and killing innocent civilians. In the short term, we're faced with a security challenge. And we have to address that challenge with a new strategy that recognizes that many of the post-World War I mandates that created new states are illegitimate, and that we need to stop organizing our efforts around nation states that aren't viable and start working with our friends rather than trying to placate our foes. So I'll submit to you today that our best friends in the Middle East are actually the Kurds in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, and we should be expanding our security assistance and our political and diplomatic support to their efforts, not only as our allies, but to stand up new nation states that are much more credible and legitimate than some of the states that currently exist. This is the 100-year anniversary this week of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A British diplomat, Mark Sykes, and a French diplomat, Georges Picot, while the armies of Europe were battling, got together in fancy hotels and decided to draw up a new map of the Middle East. Their efforts were enshrined at the Treaty of Paris and later the Treaty of Sèvres, which took the Ottoman Empire and assigned territories to Britain and France. Britain was given Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. France, of course, got the beachfront properties in Lebanon and Syria. These states are not functioning. The reason why the Islamic State has asserted itself and crashed these borders is because they have a legitimate historical grievance. Their grievance is based on the fact that groups, sectarian and ethnic, were combined into state structures that were comprised in a way that was inorganic and didn't have any legitimacy with the people that they were ruling. The way the international system is based relies on nation states. The UN is a club of member states. They work together to determine how they're going to advance their national interests. When the US decided to invade and occupy Iraq in 2003, we unleashed a Pandora's box of challenges. We got rid of the Iraqi army and the Ba'athist social services. In beheading the regime of Saddam Hussein, we unleashed forces that we didn't know and couldn't manage. These forces launched an insurgency in Iraq in 2005. Al-Qaeda morphed into Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. With the civil war in Syria that started in 2009 and was full-blown in 2011, we saw a conflation of Sunni Arabs fighting against regimes and occupation. They came across the border in June of 2014 and occupied Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. And by seizing Mosul, they essentially created a caliphate, a self-declared caliphate, based on Sharia law, which is the headquarters of the Islamic State. So our response to that was to step back and to rely on the government in Baghdad and later the government in Damascus to try to counter this sort of violent extremism. Clearly that hasn't been effective. Right now, a half of Syria is occupied, a third of Iraq is occupied. The Islamic State has a message which it has been using to recruit around the world. There are 25,000 international recruits from 92 countries who have gone through Turkey into Iraq and Syria in order to join the battle. So we need to be steely-eyed in assessing realities. We've invested an enormous amount of troop and treasure into stabilizing Iraq. Well, I submit to you today that Iraq is a failed state, that it's actively working against US interests. It's a proxy for Iran. When Russia wanted to transport weapons through Iraqi airspace to its base in Latakia in Syria, the US sent an envoy to ask them to block access to the airspace, and the envoy was simply rebuffed. Well, after having lost 4,441 men and women, 25,000 seriously injured, spent several $1 trillion, I would have expected the government in Baghdad to be more accommodating to US interests. But that hasn't been the case. We still stand behind a one Iraq policy, which is fundamentally based on flawed assumptions. It's delusional. In the process, we've neglected the Iraqi Kurds and their fighters who are called Peshmerga, those who stand before death. The only fighters in Iraq that have been able to roll back gains of the Islamic State are the Iraqi Kurds. We seem to be cottoning on to that reality. Just 10 days ago, Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, announced $415 million in direct budgetary support to help the Kurdish militia. They are simply flat broke with the price of oil having crashed, unable to provide basic services or security. It's unrealistic for the United States to think that the Peshmerga are going to be able to fight against the Islamic State if they're not materially supported. The Obama administration has shown an ability to adapt at the 11th hour, at the last minute, but just before it's too late. We did that in Kobani as well, in Syria. The city of Kobani on Turkey's border was 80% occupied by the Islamic State. Ryan Crocker, the former US ambassador, said, "We don't have a strategic interest in Kobani." But had Kobani fallen and all of its residents been slaughtered and beheaded, that would have been used by the Islamic State as a recruitment tool. So at the last minute we intervened. We dropped weapons, we launched close air support to the fighters. 40% of the defenders of Kobani, the Syrian Kurds, were women. And they did a remarkable job of fighting against the Islamic State and ultimately liberating Kobani. The grinding civil war in Syria is going on. There's no end in sight. The UN, which is acting as a mediator, has been convening a series of meetings in Geneva. Remarkably, the UN has decided to exclude the Syrian Kurds from those political negotiations. They're doing that for one reason simply. Turkey objects. The Syrian Kurds have spiritual and historic ties to the PKK, which is a group of Kurds in Turkey who have fought for their basic political and cultural rights over many decades. Because Turkey objects, the Syrian Kurds are pushed to the margin. When Brett McGurk, who's our acting envoy for the opposition to ISIS, went to Syria and met with the Syrian Kurds publicly, he was rebuffed by the government in Ankara. And what kind of a government in Ankara do we have? It is Islamist, it's authoritarian. Just yesterday, the president organized the dismissal of the prime minister. It's known for its crackdown on freedom of expression. This is a NATO ally on whom we rely. So I submit to you that if NATO were being established today, because of Turkey's domestic politics and its well-documented support to ISIS, running the jihadi highway from Turkey into Raqqa, providing weapons, logistics, medical care for wounded warriors, that Turkey just simply wouldn't be admitted into NATO. So if we're going to be effective in meeting the challenge of violent extremism, we need to be realistic in knowing who are our friends and who are our allies. Iraq is a country that simply doesn't exist. There's a placard at the UN that says Iraq, but functionally it's divided between Arab Shiites, Arab Sunnis. The Kurds have established a de facto independent state in the north. Likewise, Syria is a state where 250,000 people have been killed, half of the population has been displaced. President Obama drew a red line in the sand saying that we wouldn't tolerate the use of chemical weapons. But when it came time to enforcing that, he subcontracted the job of disarming Syria to Russia. And now there are renewed reports of Syrian forces bombing hospitals, using phosphorus, dropping all kinds of chemical weapons and other munitions through helicopter gunships. The only force that's shown it's effective in Syria are called the People's Protection Forces, and these are the militias of the Syrian Kurds. Now in Turkey, the PKK, to which I referred to earlier, is technically classified as a foreign terrorist organization. There was a deal made with Turkey after 9/11. They would head the International Assistance Force for Afghanistan, in exchange for which we would renew our commitment to labeling and treating the PKK as a terror group. I've published and recommended that we remove the PKK from the list of foreign terrorist organizations, that we deepen our security cooperation with them in Syria, and that we more fully engage them as security partners. Whether it's in Sinjar, where Yazidi women and girls were abducted and raped en masse, whether it's outside of Erbil, where the Kurdish forces represented a last line preventing the invasion and occupation of the city by the Islamic State, or in Kobani, where Kurds came together to defend against the Islamic State's aggression, we've discovered that our best ally in the region are Kurdish militias. So we need to be steely-eyed in our assessment. There are some states upon which we've based our security cooperation that simply don't function. And if they do function, they operate against U.S. interests. They operate in the interests of countries that would seek to do us harm. In the case of Baghdad, it operates on behalf of Iran. In the case of Syria and Damascus, it operates on behalf of Iran and of Russia. If we want to be effective in realizing President Obama's goal of destroying the Islamic State, we can't do that from a high altitude with warplanes alone. We need fighters on the ground, and the fighters that have proven effective are the Kurdish militias. Now, this doesn't replace the need for a long-term strategy that drains the swamp of support, the need for messaging so that young people around the world realize that there's an alternative to radical extremism. But we're going to be involved in a generational struggle against the Islamic State if we're not more efficient in what we do and more prudent in deciding with whom we engage. There's an adage that the Kurds often recount. We have no friend but the mountains, because they've always fled to the mountains when they were attacked. Well, today I submit to you that the United States has no friend in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey except the Kurds. And the sooner we wake up to that reality and we deepen our cooperation, the more successful we'll be in our counterterrorism and the more secure the world will be. Thank you for your attention.